Hello and welcome everyone to Textile Talks. I am Laura Chapman from the International Quilt Museum. As people join in for the webinar, I'd like to share some information with you about Textile Talks in case you are joining us for the first time. Textile Talks features weekly presentations and panel discussions from the International Quilt Museum, Modern Quilts Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. We hold these programs every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern or 11 a.m. Pacific right here on Zoom. Next week, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles will present Social Justice Sewing Academy with Sarah Trail. As an attendee of today's talk, you will receive an email with a link to register for the program. We would like to thank our sponsors who make it possible for us to provide these textile talks for free. Thank you to Moda Fabrics, Aurifil, CNT Publishing, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Attached Ink, Misty Fuse, Artistic Artifacts, Nine Patch Fabrics, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. We respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. Please use the Q&A for questions, chat box for greeting others, and survey for commentary on ways we can improve. If you prefer not to see notifications from the chat during this webinar, you can click on the chat button to toggle them on or off. With that, it's my honor to introduce today's presenter. Sandra Sider, a New York quilt artist since the early 1980s, is editor of Art Quilt Quarterly and curator of the Texas Quilt Museum, as well as past president of Studio Art Quilt Associates. She holds an MA in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. Sider has written or edited more than a dozen books concerning contemporary quilt art, including Art Quilts Unfolding 50 Years of Innovation. She teaches the History of Textiles course in the MFA Textiles program at Parsons School of Design in New York and is a fabric designer. Sandra is also the curator of Abstract Design in American Quilts at 50, New York Nexus, which is now showing at the International Quilt Museum, and what we'll be talking about today. Again, if you have any questions for Sandra during today's program, we encourage you to type them in the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. With that, welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Laura. I want to thank you for inviting me to do this and welcome all of the people who are there listening in the webinar. It was so much fun, all the many months we worked on this exhibition. And I would like to share with you a little bit more about the artists in New York Nexus. We're going to see some more of their early works. We are going to see some vintage portraits of them, which is a lot of fun. And we'll learn a little bit more about the New York art scene right about the time that abstract design and American Quilts opened at the Whitney in 1971. I'm going to do this by beginning with a recorded PowerPoint, and then afterwards we'll have discussion, question, answers. And so I hope you enjoy it. Let's take a look. Perspective. If we recall a few historical facts from that time period, back to the land hippie groups had rebelled against the consumer society, resulting in some heartfelt textile art, including naive but functional quilts. In 1971, the United States had been involved in the Vietnam War for 6 years and would be for another 2 years, with massive anti-war protests across the country in the late 60s and early 70s. A new national politics promising racial equality was in full swing, and the so-called sexual revolution and women's movement were as much about challenging authority and the legitimacy of gender roles as it was about having more sex. In New York City, many of these protests were organized by artists and were directed at museums. This activism during the late 1960s and early 1970s was the first wave of what would become several art movements practically run by the artist, an environment in which virtually anything could be art. In 1970, the Ad Hoc Women's Art Committee, which included Faith Ringgold as well as critic Lucy Lapard, led a protest against the predominantly male Whitney Annual exhibition. The protesters sent a letter to the museum demanding that half of the artists in the exhibition should be women and half of them should be Black. There were numerous demonstrations and sit-ins prior to the exhibition opening. For example, Protesters placed tampons and raw eggs bearing the 50% message in the galleries and the staircases. In her memoir, Faith Ringgold describes some of the events of the campaign. The Whitney Museum became the focus of our attention. We went there often to deposit eggs. Unsuspecting male curatorial staff would pick up the eggs and experience the shock of having raw eggs slide down the pants of their fine tailor-made suits. Generally, everywhere the staff went, they found loud and clear messages that women artists were on the Whitney's case. Many of the art protests also were against the continued involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. In many instances, the anti-war movement became intertwined with racial politics, partly because so many young Black men were being killed in action in Vietnam. Then in turn, the focus on several museums in New York demanded more equitable exhibitions, with women as well as African-American artists being more fairly represented. The very meaning of art was being questioned, and whether art should have a context or at least a content that related to what was going on in the world and in the lives of the artists. This was the volatile environment in which the Whitney decided to mount abstract design in American Quilts in the summer of 1971. During the early 1970s, Michael Cummings was residing in New York, being mentored by Paul Smith, director of the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, as Michael gradually transitioned from paper collage to what would later be termed art quilts. Just before abstract design in American Quilts opened at the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art had been showing a solo exhibition of works by Romar Bearden titled The Prevalence of Ritual. The show included his recently completed fabric collage patchwork quilt made in 1970, and this exhibition was hugely influential on Michael Cummings. He later was mentored by Bearden, meeting with the artist in his studio. The 1971 Romar Bearden exhibition was a direct result of demands made by the Art Workers Coalition, another activist organization that advocated for New York City museums to improve their ethical relationship with artists and the public. They argued that museums should improve public access by waiving admission fees and by implementing more inclusive exhibition policies to encourage shows by women and minorities. So, when the quilt show opened at the Whitney, members of the public, including the makers in our New York Nexus exhibition, were already sensitized to issues of gender politics and to art outside the descriptive terms of modernism. While many of the quilts resemble the graphic style of abstract expressionist paintings, they were something else entirely, imbued with a tradition of use. In his 1980 book, Art in the 70s, British art critic and curator Edward Lucy Smith was among the first to acknowledge publicly that what was considered high art, the art of the museum, and other forms of activity to which the word art may be implied, were slotted into stylistic categories used to describe art up until about the 70s that no longer fit into something which he termed infinitely more complex and in many ways much closer to the concerns of ordinary life. Lucy Smith went on to emphasize that much of this art serves a utilitarian purpose. I think we can safely say that quilts in this sense would fit perfectly into any art conversation about the 1970s, especially when quilts have a tradition of use that can be eclipsed or even exaggerated by their tradition of style. The tension that can be created by confounding the two traditions is what empowers many of today's art quilts. Abstract design in American Quilts was inspirational and even provocative for the artists of New York Nexus, who began to see the potential for working with quilted constructions in their studio practice. Here we have a 1975 machine and hand-sewn fabric collage by Michael Cummings, 14 inches high in a modified cubist style. Under Bearden's influence, this artist began working in a narrative mode in both fabric and paper. Throughout his career after the 1970s, Michael Cummings has created art quilts relating to Afro-Caribbean and African-American themes, often celebrating heroic figures. His Young Obama, now owned by the International Quilt Museum, is in the New York Nexus exhibition. At the tender age of 10 years, Robin Schwab was already delving into fiber art, as we can see from the felted dinosaur she made for her little brother's birthday present. More seriously, her art training included printmaking, and here we have an example from 1972, an etching made during her junior year of college. Robin mainly studied drawing and painting, techniques that later would feed into her studio practice with art quilts, which she began making in the mid-1970s. Unfortunately, or as Robin says, luckily, we do not have any images of those early pieces. In addition, she worked as a projectionist at the Thalia Theater in New York. It seems to me that Robin's immersion in cinematic images on actual film may have influenced the sort of repetitive graphic imagery that we often see in her quilts. Look at the rhythm and movement with which she filled the surface of PCB Bop, one of her quilts in the exhibition. Paula Stern loves both color and pattern, which has served as the touchstones of her work for several decades. From hand embroidery in the 1970s, which we see at the upper left, to the kaleidoscopic imagery for which she is now best known. At the bottom left, we see a detail from one of her 1994 quilts. Paula very generously allowed me to share with you her very first quilt, which we see to the right. She made it when she went to college, ripping up old clothing to make 10-inch squares, which she then machine stitched together and stuffed with a blanket, calling that a quilt. By the early 1980s, her technique had improved significantly, as can be seen at the top in the quilt she made for her bed. At the bottom is another early quilt, which Paula attributes to the influence of Michael James. However, the color palette resonates with some of the quilts in the Whitney show. Here is what Paula says about the impact of that exhibition on her. The Whitney exhibit was a practical object lesson. I probably did not inspect the stitching as much as I inhaled the colors. I didn't have a lot of extra funds, but I purchased the Souvenir Weekly calendar and it became a textbook. I pored over it. Interestingly, although the sensibility of the intense solid fabrics used in the homage quilts match my own, my passion for combining patterned fabric won out, using intricate charismatic fabric to transform a quilt of simple shapes into a dramatic spectacle continues to be a major theme in my work. And we can certainly see that effect in Kaleidoscopic 3, Stained Glass Anthology, one of Paula's quilts in New York Nexus. Sue Benner was nowhere near New York City in 1971, since she was a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. But quilts and fiber art resonated with her aesthetic approach and with her feminist politics. Her wool scrap quilt from 1975 is closest to works in the Abstract Design and American Quilts exhibition. Benner made it of wool clothing scraps from her mother, her sister, a long-gone boyfriend, and herself. In the slide above that quilt is an image of a quilt titled Cross Section of a Fallopian Tube that was part of her senior honors thesis, an entire exhibition illustrating the human reproductive system. Throughout her career as an artist, Sue Benner has relied on the grid as a mainstay of her quilt aesthetics. This formal approach to composition references antique piece quilts, especially those constructed of square and rectangular blocks. Concerning geometric quilt designs, she says, the geometry comes directly out of the cloth itself and the process of sewing. Cloth is woven with a warp and weft at right angles to each other and tears along these lines quite easily. Even when carefully cutting fabric to a size, the square, rectangular, and strip are obvious and certainly the easiest to sew back together. Complicated curves can be cut and sewn, but additional skill and attention is needed. So fabric is ripped, cut, stitched back together, and grids and other geometric structures are formed. This is not to say that the quilt is accidentally beautiful or unintentionally powerful. Quite the contrary. Patricia Saw also favors grid-based compositions, although she often uses vinyl-backed metallic mylar rather than fabric to create sharply defined dimensional geometry. The large quilt pictured here was a 1960s liturgical commission. The other two works, for which traditional quilt designs were one of her inspirations, are from the 1970s. Patricia saw abstract design in American Quilts at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., where she studied at Catholic University, earning an MFA focused on painting. We definitely can see that grid influence in Sundoor, her quilt in New York Nexus, where the portal seems to me to reference a 4-patch quilt. Marilyn Henson's first quilt was this Cathedral Windows, 97 inches high, begun in 1975 and completed in 1978. Of course, we're looking at a detail here. During the 1970s, she was somewhat busy, raising 4 children, managing 2 homes, working full-time as a career counselor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, attending night school, and, as if all that were not enough, hosting poetry reading salons, as well as making and exhibiting her art. She informs us that she is a native New Yorker, and her aesthetic vision has always been deeply rooted in the urban geometry of her surroundings, from the earliest works in geometric abstraction to the more recent mixed media textile works. Her Cathedral Windows has poetry from T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets embroidered on the back, and her connection with poetry has remained an integral part of her life and of her work. Marilyn completed both these quilts in 1989. On the left is 167 and counting. She was counting the number of days to retirement in anticipation of being able to focus on making art full-time. The joyous sphere of colors symbolized her quilting life looming over the structured work life soon to be superseded. On the right is Echoes in the Garden. This work is about memories. The title is derived from a poem by T.S. Eliot. Footfalls echo in my memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in my mind. Memories have served Marilyn Henson well in her career as a quilt artist. This quilt, which is in our exhibition, references colorful beach umbrellas with striped fabrics sort of whirling around the hexagonal surface. And now we come to an artist who should have been in New York Nexus, but I was not aware of her connection with the exhibition until very recently. Theresa Barker first became aware of the Whitney exhibition when she read an article in Newsweek in January of 1972. Theresa remembers being in Washington, D.C. around the time that the quilts were on exhibit at the Renwick Gallery. She approached the Renwick, attracted by the poster outside featuring a beautiful circles with crosses quilt. But the exhibition was closed for some reason or had just ended. She remembers being extremely disappointed. The first opportunity that she had to see images of those quilts came when she bought the small catalog, American Quilts, published for that Renwick exhibition. As the years went by, she bought every book that she could find on the show to see the quilts in color and to read more about this amazing appreciation of quilts as art. Theresa's quilt here, completed in 1977, was a wedding gift made for a friend who got married in 1976. The title is The Bicentennial Bride's Quilt, and our bicentennial year of 1976 was certainly a watershed year for quilts in the United States. With the International Quilt Museum currently celebrating the 50th anniversary of abstract design in American quilts, it seems appropriate to end this formal part of my lecture with an image of Theresa Barker's quilt celebrating the 10th anniversary. The Whitney Stamp is pieced, appliqued, and painted. Theresa drafted her pattern from an article in Scientific American about optical illusions with a color palette based on antique Amish quilts. This piece is her homage to the collecting genius of Gail Vanderhoof and Jonathan Holstein, and to the Whitney Museum's amazing leap of faith in 1971.
There was a question about Cellular 8, and the question was, are the blue and black lines painted over or part of the original fabric?
The blue and black lines. Which one is this?
That's, I believe, Sue Benner's Cellular 8.
Sue does a lot of painting and stamping, over things that she's pieced. So I'm sure that's painted over.
Okay.
I haven't seen the original quilt. The quilt is actually at the International Quilt Museum, so I've never seen the original.
And I have seen the original, and I'm sorry, I cannot remember. You can see it a little bit more up close on our website. I did share a link to the online exhibition in the chat box, but I'll share that again just to make sure that
I'm sure it is, because Sue does so much surface design with her work.
All right, and let me see, do we have any other questions? All right. The question is, can you say more about Radka Donnell's inclusion in the exhibit?
Yes, Radka, whom I met a couple of times, was not included in my talk, nor was Joan Lintow, because they're both deceased, and part of my talk was based on intensive interviews with the artist. Radka Donnell was Swiss, and she was trained as an artist, and she was recognized early on by people like Michael James as a very painterly quilt artist. And I think there's 2 pieces by her in the museum, and she did not follow any sort of rules. She was self-taught for quilt making. Her formal training was as a painter, and she just did swaths of fabric that she would sew together and not be really too judgy about how she did the quilting, and put it together as big pieces. But she was very prolific. She worked in series, and some of her quilts were quite spiritual in the themes. So she's a little bit, not being an American, she's a little bit out of American quilt history, but I think she was influential on people because of the way she worked. And Radka saw one of the European exhibitions of the show that originated at the Whitney. And when I met her, once was in Lincoln, I believe, and another time in New York, she mentioned that show, which I remembered, which is why she's in the exhibition.
And just to share with everyone, we have an update. I was excited first. We had Carolyn Ducey, our curator of collections, chiming in with an answer about Sue Benner's piece, but we have the artist herself who let us know that the ovals are fused fabric as well as painted and monoprinted motifs. So that answers the question. Thank you, Sue, for asking. We have another question. Who was the artist for the hexagon quilt Brighton Beach Memories?
That's Marilyn Henson. She has a couple of quilts in that style, actually. Not in the show. One is in the show.
Okay. And then we had another question. Sandra, did you see the original exhibit? If so, how did it influence your own creative path?
I did not even know about it. I was having babies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 1971, 1972. The first show that really influenced me in New York, and I want to get this date right, was the show at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts which was the New American Quilt. I believe that's the title of it. Yeah. In the mid-70s at the Museum of American Crafts. I walked into that on a visit to New York, and I stayed 2 hours. And I remember it because my husband was babysitting and I was about an hour late getting back. I'll never forget that. But I never saw the show. I saw the catalog. After I saw the show in the mid-70s at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, I started buying all the quilt exhibition catalogs I could get a hold of. And, you know, it wasn't easy back then. We didn't have the internet. You know, I wrote bookstores and I looked online. And of course, when Quilter's newsletter came around, you could sort of ask questions there and find things. But no, I unfortunately did not see the original show and did not even know anything about it down there in the South.
Thank you. Well, I guess that kind of leads me then to a question. You mentioned a little bit about the first exhibit you recall seeing and then following with that. How would you say, when did you actually start creating as an artist art quilts or quilts?
You have to understand that I was raised in Appalachia with women who made quilts. And as a little girl, you know, I would sit when I visited my grandmother. They had this big frame that came down from the ceiling with a pulley. And I would sit with one of my cousins underneath the quilt. And I remember seeing the sun come through the colors. And sometimes we were told to stick the needle back up through, you know, sort of to help, sort of. And that was part of my heritage. I have quilts from my aunt, from my grandmother. But I, like many women I was the first woman from that whole generation, from that family in the mountains of Western North Carolina to go to college down in Chapel Hill. And I deracinated myself. I didn't want to have anything to do with all those old fashioned things. And, you know, I wanted to sort of, you know, become a scholar, and I studied comparative literature and I love poetry. And then I started traveling. I got married, and I noticed every time we went anywhere, the museums I wanted to go see were the decorative arts museums and the folk art museums. And that just started coming back to me. And then I wanted to make quilts for, you know, my babies. And I called my Aunt Judith, and she said, well, you should have paid more attention. Of course, you know, she's right. And I bought Beth Gutchin's Perfect Patchwork Primer. I was in Chapel Hill in a bookstore there, and you know, started making, you know, traditional quilts. And it wasn't until I guess it was about after that show, that mid-70s show in New York, I started doing some abstractions. I made a big sort of outer space sort of quilt with planets and things like that. And then in 1979, I learned about cyanotype blueprinting, which has followed me all the way through now for, oh my God, it's more than 30 years now. I had a friend who was a photographer. She was in New York. She wanted to make a couple of photo quilts, and I wanted to learn how to put images on fabric without having to have a, you know, press or anything like that. And so we had this wonderful day where I taught her about fabric and quilting, basic instructions, and she taught me how to put cyanotype on fabric. And so I guess you would say my very first was 1979 that I would, you know, consider surface design art quilts.
Wonderful, thank you. I realized as we're talking about these other stories, it's always great to hear another artist's
Everybody's story is so interesting. It's amazing. I just love to hear people talk about this.
Yeah. Well, we have a few more questions. Another one asks, are you seeing a link to the social awareness of these early quilts and quilts today?
I'm not sure what could the person ask the question and say what you mean by social awareness? Is it connections with women's issues, or could that person just quickly type
Sure. You know,
clarification?
We'll ask for that clarification, and while we wait for that, I have another question lined up. Can you talk about art quilting as an art since the 1970s? What barriers remain?
What barriers remain? Mm-hmm. Auction houses. We need a big major auction catalog in an auction house of art quilts. When that barrier is broken, then we're in. We don't have what's called secondary values a secondary market yet for art quilts. It's coming, but I don't know if I'll live to see it, but that's when we will break through, and then museums will really begin to take art quilts seriously. We need to have an auction market.
Thank you. Okay, so still waiting for clarification on that other question, but have a couple more. How can quilters be part of the protest movements today?
Oh, they are so much. I mean, next week's talk with Sarah Trail gives you an idea about the social justice involvement. But look what Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi has been doing just in Minneapolis with her Black Lives Matter quilts. In fact, Art Quilt Quarterly, the issue after the one coming up, is going to have an article by Carolyn, on that whole social justice movement with Black Lives Matter. And it's also, issues of transgender discrimination, I expect, after what's happened last year with so many women losing their jobs, and now women expected to be back as the homemakers and not having jobs, I expect to see a new wave of feminist art coming out of women's studios in the next 2 to 3 years about that. Quilts are such a great medium for protest because they're subversive. They're soft, they're nurturing, and yet they're in your face. I mean, look at the quilts about gun violence, for example, the whole SACWA exhibition we had. And I have to say that kudos to SACWA as a driving force, on these issues. It's constant. I don't think it's going to end because these issues are not going to end. But quilts are quilts are a perfect medium for that.
Well, and I think that it sounds like that's kind of what the original question that we had was kind of asking too. It's you mentioned that artists were reacting to social issues like women's issues, war, et cetera, and how are quilters reacting similarly today? So,
and environment. Look at the environmental artists: Bonnie Peterson, Linda Gass. I mean, there's a whole Alicia Merritt. There's a whole group of quilt artists who are very much involved with climate change, with pollution, with issues of infrastructure, budgeting conflicts about, shall we build more highways for more cars, or shall we put money in public transportation? There's a whole subgroup of quilt artists who are involved with that.
Thank you. Here's another question. It says, thanks for the initial presentation. Most of these are fairly older from artists in the original show, which is great. Will you be presenting anything about Abstraction Today 50 years later?
Will I be presenting
anything about Abstraction Today 50 years later?
You mean anything more?
That's right. That might be, I mean, so some of these pieces that are featured in the exhibit are fairly recently made. And that's maybe something, if you go and look on the online exhibit and at some of the information, you'll see the dates of them. It's kind of, we're seeing, what would you say is the earliest dated, do you off the top of your head, do you know the earliest dated quilt that's featured in New York Nexus, and maybe the most recent one?
Well, the most recent one I think is 24. I really don't know. It's in the 20 teens. I forget whose that is. Everybody has to realize this was a year ago. I'm not sure we have anything that's in the 70s. Well, of course, Michael's collage. We have Michael's collage from very early because he wasn't doing quilts right then. The problem with, we couldn't have earlier quilts in the show because look at Robin Schwab. She doesn't have photographs of any of those quilts she did in the 70s. And I can sort of understand, saying I've moved beyond that. But, I've got everything I ever made that I haven't sold or given away. It's up there in the attic. And, I don't want some of it in an exhibition, but I can't quite make a doggy bed out of it. I can't bring myself to do that. We try to have a quilt by an earlier quilt and a later quilt by everybody in the exhibition, where we could. Joan Lintow, we were only able to have one quilt. Joan sold most of everything that she made. And the thing with Radka is that I would have liked to have had more quilts, but Radka's quilts, quite a few of them were used on beds, and they're not exhibition condition anymore. We have that problem sometimes too. But we, you know, I tried to give a span. So there's at least, I think 15 years, maybe 20 between the first and second quilt of most everybody in the show.
And for anyone who's joining us today who maybe isn't aware, this is one of 4 exhibitions that we have up on display right now at the International Quilt Museum. The first is Abstract Design and American Quilts at 50. In the International Quilt Museum's last textile talk, we had Jonathan Holstein and curator Carolyn Ducey on to talk about that, and you can actually watch the recording. But in addition to that, we wanted to share how that exhibition influenced arts quilting, influenced quilt making in homes, influenced quilt making around the world. And we'll go into those in future programs that we have throughout the summer, but those are all on display right now in the form of New York Nexus, Raising the Profile, and Journey to Japan. Oh, great, we have a few more questions.
I just want to say those are very excellent essays in that catalog too, by all the curators. I learned a lot. I recently reread them, and they're very interesting material.
Well, thank you. I'll make sure to pass that along to my colleagues. So, oh, there is a question. Is there a reason why all the quilts are not shown on the website, or at least listed, so we can try to pull them up through the search or browse function? So I can answer that. The reason we do not have all of them up on our website is we have the quilts that are from our collection up on the website, and that often has to do with the type of photos that we have and the type of information and such. If you we have a video on the website that you can kind of see a walkthrough that gives you more of an idea about the sizes, and you can take a little bit closer look, but that's kind of the reasoning behind it. It's a lot of times we try to do that to be respectful of the copyright of artists and such, to make sure that we're protecting that. We had another question. Do you think men's quilts get more attention than women's? Do men need to make them to legitimize them as art?
I certainly do think that men's quilts still get more attention than some of the quilts by women, but my gosh, some of them deserve to. I mean, Joe Cunningham. I do know there was a lot of resentment maybe 20 years ago when men started getting more attention because they were men. I mean, just think of how much attention a very famous. What if Lee Bonacu had gotten the attention that she deserved as a painter in the middle of the century? I can imagine the men might have been a little bit resentful if that had happened. I think a lot of male quilters have paid their dues now. And Kay Fassett, I mean, he designs for quilters now. I mean, he teaches workshops that women learn design in. So I do think we're coming to the point where the male people involved in the art quilt world and the traditional quilt world are being appreciated a little bit more. When you've been involved in it for 20 or 30 years, you've paid your dues, and you belong in that world. So yeah, I had resentment, 20, 25 years ago when I started seeing, a few male artists like getting all the interviews, getting all the attention. And then, suddenly I said, what is your problem? They're talking about art quilts. This can only help all of us in the end. So that's my philosophy now. As long as they're doing art quilts and it's great work, well, more power to them.
Great, thank you. And actually, so I do have a couple of updates. My colleague Jonathan Gregory, who curated Raising the Profile, actually had a couple of updates. So to talk about just kind of the span, it sounds like the Michael Cummings piece you referenced was made in 1973, and the most recent piece was made in 2019. So it really does cover, about 50 years, maybe more like 45 in terms of quilt making. And then he also mentioned that the information about all of the quilts exhibited in all of these exhibitions are available in that catalog, along with the essays that Sandra mentioned. We have a couple more questions. This was a follow-up, I think, regarding the Radka pieces. What is exhibition condition? Oh,
okay. This is something that I run into as curator of the Texas Quilt Museum quite a bit. For an art quilt, you have to have a quilt that is clean, that is not damaged, not coming apart in any way, that can be exhibited without being damaged, depending on how it's supposed to be hung. Some quilts are extremely fragile. We have to be very careful. It's a different situation with traditional quilts. And at the museum, we've had a long talks in the board meetings about where do you draw the line when you don't show a traditional quilt because it's been used so much. And in a way, you want to honor the use, you want to honor the history. But when people pay money to come into a museum to see a quilt show, they really don't want to see, you know, half the quilts that have tears on the edges, that have stains on them, that the batting is coming out of them. And so sometimes if we have a spectacular quilt that has little pieces where the silk is a little shattered or something, we'll put that in the show. And then in the note, I will say, note that this quilt was used, you know, on a bed, thus the examples of use. But you can't do that very much in a museum exhibition because people don't come, they don't pay to see something like that. It's different if you have a history museum, for example, where you have the quilts of a certain state. And it's the history, you know, of the women's history of that state. Then that show can have something with more use, but still not something that looks like it was dragged behind the lawnmower. You know, people don't come to see that at a museum.
There was one question. It said, please repeat the name of the exhibit catalog that you referenced. I believe that was when you were talking about that first exhibit and catalog that you saw that kind of inspired you.
I want to get the exact name of it. Just give me a second here. I'm pretty sure it's the Modern Quilt. Or maybe the New American Quilt. I remember it's the New American Quilt at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts. I'm pretty sure it was 1976. I don't know if their catalogs available. That what I had was kind of a little, you know, just a brochure kind of catalog that was there at the show, but maybe on, you know, eBay it might be available. The Museum of Contemporary Crafts was a great place for quilts and fiber art to be shown. And kudos to Paul Smith, who was the director at the time. He was amazing.
Wonderful. Well, so while we have you here, can you tell us a little bit about maybe some other projects you're working on right now, if you have any books in the works, maybe if there's anything exciting coming out in the next issue of your magazine and other exhibits you're working on?
Well, yeah. During quarantine last year, and some people on this webinar might be the artists in the book, I got the idea of, I dragged my husband out to our house in Pennsylvania to leave the contagion in New York, and we stayed 6 months. And I made a little studio there in the downstairs area, and I sat there and thought, what is everybody else doing? What, you know, is everybody else is like scared and you know, in as much turmoil as I am? And so I just put out a call. What is everybody doing? Is anyone working on quilts? And Carrie Bressenham sort of got a hold of it because I work for her at the museum in Texas. And she said, let's have a show in Houston. And so it ended up being a call for entries for an exhibit and a book. Of course, the exhibit didn't happen because the festival was canceled, but it ended up being the most amazing experience with all these makers on 97, I think 220 people sent me images of quilts they made in quarantine. And it ranged from people who, you know, were trying to juggle working at home and small children and food scarcity, to people who, let's face it, quilters were born for quarantine. Quilters that have stashes, I mean, they've got everything they need right there as long as they have light and electricity. And people were amazing, and everybody had to send me a narrative. You know, what is it like working there? You know, how are you managing? And so the book, it's Quarantine Quilts, Creativity in the Midst of Chaos, and it's coming out with Schiffer thank you, Schiffer, for your sponsorship of this, in probably July. And there will be an exhibit of 27 quilts in Paducah at the Quilt Museum, and then in Lowell at the New England Quilt Museum. Then the quilts go back to the makers. We didn't try to make a big tour of it because, please God, by next year, nobody wants to hear anything about COVID or quarantine or any of that. But the book it's a document of what it was like last year, because 50 years from now, who knows what will be left of all these wonderful blogs. And, I don't know what evidence somebody 100 years from now certainly might not have access to everything that went on. So it's nice to have that documentation of what we went through.
Absolutely. We had another question come in that was, have there been any gatekeepers who originally snubbed the idea of art quilts, but who now have changed their tune and realized the value of fiber arts?
Well, I'd say quite a few museum directors from the last 20 years. I won't name any names who have come around at this point. I think that when you say gatekeepers, you're talking about magazine editors, museum directors, people like that who can expose people and give them a leg up. And of course, why would anyone who's supporting painting, printmaking, and sculpture support anybody doing an art quilt? They have their art forms. So, I've said this before, it sounds kind of nasty, but I think a whole generation has to die off, and then the art quilt will really flourish in another, 15, 20 years. That sounds really mean, but I'm afraid it's true.
I think this was in follow-up to the question about quilts being in condition to be able to be exhibited. There were some questions about, for example, quilts like the G's Bend quilts, which were ones that were made for utility purposes, but then also traveled widely. I think the question is the kind of distinction there, perhaps.
Well, there wasn't I reviewed the show, The Quilts of G's Bend at the Whitney, by the way, in 2002, maybe 2002, I'm pretty sure. And those quilts were in good condition. They, picked and chose, some of the nicer ones. And that was a mind-blowing exhibition, I have to say, and how interesting it was at the Whitney. But they said, that I think some of the best quilts were sent. I actually have been to Boynton and G's Bend and met some of the makers. I've been to the cooperative, and I had lunch at one of the Petway ladies' houses, and there actually was a piece of a quilt that was a dog bed. So, they used their quilts, and there was one of their quilts on the bed. The little boy was rolling up in it. But there are other quilts that were sent, for the exhibition. So that there was a conscious choice of, we're sending, the nicer pieces, the pieces not used so much. That I think probably some of them came from the cooperative store because they had been put aside to sell. So, they were nice as well.
And that's something I'm sure you see as well too, and your work with the Texas Quilt Museum and other exhibitions, and it's something we certainly see at the International Quilt Museum, is kind of the notion of, we see it as survivor bias. A lot of the quilts that you'll see in our collection on display are ones that were perhaps the show pieces. These were pieces that were well kept and cared for throughout the years, whereas a lot of the pieces that were used every day maybe didn't survive. That said, there are still objects that they may have been used, but perhaps their care just still, every quilt's a little bit different. Every condition in which a quilt is kept is different. And so again, sometimes a quilt can be well loved, but it can still also have the stability to be able to actually hang on display too, because that's something we think about a lot at the museum, as well as just their actual condition to be able to safely display it without causing permanent damage, so that for future generations to be able to.
There are some beautiful quilts that are in great condition, and you really can't display them because of the fabric. Like some of the crazy quilts with some of the silks with the fugitive dyes. I mean, a month in light and you've got a problem there. So those are more like study quilts or quilts you can publish, but you really don't want to hang them up. And plus the structure might not be that stable, which is another issue to consider.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's just something we always talk about is, you know, it's, we always want to take care of that. All right. And then someone asked, what are study quilts?
Well, they're quilts that, you know, that you do not want to put up in the show because it's the kind of quilt where you have, for example, a kit that somebody bought the pieces already cut, they put it together, and there are potentially 100 of the quilts out there exactly like that quilt. So it's something that, you know, was just done for utilitarian purposes. But by the time it gets to be 40 or 50 years past that, it's interesting to study that quilt, you know, and see what fabrics were in that kit. You wouldn't necessarily want to put it in a show, but historically it becomes very interesting. The same thing happens with feed sack quilts that become interesting to study just to see how women use those feed sacks, how they cut things out and put them together. And it becomes part of cultural history as much as it becomes part of art history, more so cultural history.
Well, Sandra, thank you so much for sharing your insight with the exhibition and some of these stories, and also for answering all of our questions today. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
Just I hope as many people as possible can see the exhibition. That would be, you know, that things loosen up a little bit. And if you can't see that exhibition, see another quilt exhibition, because it's starting to open up. And you know, I'm hoping that people can get out to see things. Oh, and Deeds Not Words, celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage, that exhibition that I curated with Pam Weeks from Lowell has opened at the Visions Art Museum in San Diego, and it's open for people to come see it. So the spring has come and museums are open, and let's hope that everything becomes normal really soon.
That's right. Well, and yeah, and I'll just mention, you know, we received great news in here in Lincoln, Nebraska, where the New York Nexus is now showing that we are now able to have 75% occupancy, where we've been at 50% for a long time. And okay. So we, you know, are observing safety precautions in the galleries, but there's ample room to be able to really experience the different exhibitions as you visit us. On that note, I would once again like to remind you that we will be back next week for another textile talk presented by the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. As mentioned, it's Social Justice Sewing Academy with Sarah Trail. And on top of that, I would also like to once again thank all of our sponsors: Motive Fabrics, Aurifil, CNT Publishing, eQuilter.com, Handy Quilter, Attached Ink Misty Fuse, Artistic Artifacts, 9 Patch Fabrics, Schiffer Publishing, and thequiltshow.com. Thank you so much, Sandra, for being here with us today. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll actually just make a quick note. As we were talking beforehand, we realized that today is our 1 year birthday, 1 year anniversary of providing these textile talks. So we know so many of you have been with us from the beginning. We're so happy many of you continue to join us and have joined us along in this journey. And we look forward to sharing more programs with you again starting next week.